Johnson, and I am the Gnostic Syncretist. And this is the Gnostic Syncretist podcast. I know I haven't made a video in several months. There was a lot going on, and I'd like to resume podcasting on the many concepts related to esotericism, occultism, the ancient mystery school tradition, and the many modern iterations of these schools, from theosophy to anthroposophy to the Rosicrucians, and highlight the differences between what constitutes an esoteric tradition and what its opposite is, which is exoteric tradition or exoteric religion and religious belief versus esoteric religious belief and tradition. Because they're normally two parts of a singular system that in the ancient world was very distinguished by this obvious factor in all the different major religions from the old world, pre-Christianity. And the pagan mysteries, there were always these distinctions. And in the modern era, this has been totally lost, it seems. Not like the information's been lost, but you try to tell anybody that there is an esoteric tradition contained regarding their chosen religious system, say Christianity, they have no idea what you're talking about. They don't even have a conception of what you're talking about. It is so foreign to them that they just look at you blankly, and when you try to explain it to them, they have no conceptual framework for what you're talking about. And to be honest, I didn't either. I grew up a Christian, was confirmed in the Presbyterian Church, and then my dad passed away when I was in my early 20s, and eventually that caused me to become never atheist, but what I guess you would call agnostic or deist, until I was handed a copy of Secret Teachings of All Ages by Manly P. Hall, and that forced me to reassess everything I'd ever thought I'd known about not only religion, spirituality, but also philosophy and the nature of the universe, cosmos, and our interconnectivity to it as a human being, ensouled with a divine spark, and with all that goes with that. And I'll never forget reading his book by Manly P. Hall, that they had no idea, and how his book, The Secret Teachings, absolutely shattered any previous concepts and systems of belief that I'd thought about the nature of religion itself. And I'd never encountered it. I'd never heard of anything esoteric before, or any esoteric tradition. I was a philosophy major in college at one point, and I took a lot of the pre-Socratics and various other philosophical traditions like post-enlightenment and etc. And I'd never heard of any of this. They never mentioned Blavatsky. They never mentioned Rudolf Steiner. They never mentioned the ancient mystery schools in relation to the pre-Socratics or anything like that. It was just absolutely neglected. And also in my history degree, which I got, they never mentioned this either when you studied the history of religion at all. So it's fascinating to me that we are largely bereft in the modern world of any knowledge, popularly, en masse, as a society, regarding these traditions as the esoteric ones, or that our own chosen traditions even have an esoteric side to it. So let's boil it down to what are the two terms: esoteric versus exoteric religious belief systems and practices. So what does that mean? Well, esoteric means an inner circle of information and knowledge reserved only for those in the priesthood. Also translates to those with a specialized interest in a certain subject, or those who are initiated into that specialized subject. Reserved for the few and not necessarily for the many. And that's not a form of elitism. They simply just didn't, in the pagan traditions, ever allow the masses to encounter this information unless they were properly vetted and then allowed in on a probationary period, and then slowly rose through the ranks of initiation and became more and more ensconced in this knowledge that they kept to themselves that they thought was dangerous for the people in mass. And then you have exoteric. Well, what is an exoteric religious system of belief? Well, it's the exact opposite. It is the system of religious beliefs, rites, practices that is for the masses and the large congregations of a religious tradition. So when you go to church, when you go to the mosque, when you go to the temple and all the Abrahamic religions, you have always only an exoteric rendition offered you by the priests. That is all they will ever give you. They most of them don't even know there's even potentially an esoteric tradition at all. And if they did, they might not like what they found at all. Because even though you can say there's esoteric Judaism, esoteric, you know, Islam, and esoteric Christianity, though they are not at all like exoteric Christianity, Islam, and Judaism whatsoever. The what they tell you and how they explain the universe, God, our relationship to the universe and God, and our relationship to ourselves is completely different than what they tell you in Bible study, or they speak to you in sermons in churches or mosques or temples. They don't mention any of this stuff, unfortunately, and you're unlikely to encounter this information um, unless you're like I was handed the book by my sister, who didn't even really know what it was about either. She just bought it for me for a Christmas present. I eventually dove in months later and was astounded. If not for that, I may never have found it. I might have, but I'd never even heard of it at that point. So, you know, that's kind of how it tends to go. So, and today, there's also a contrasting belief system of the New Age um, ideas, which are enormously watered down and distorted, almost exotericized versions of some of the theosophical concepts and other many Eastern religious concepts that have been popularized and are being used for profiteering. Some of them are fine. Others are not great at all. Like fantastical things about the Pleiadians or the Galactic Councils, or these like spiritual aliens that are connected to mankind and talking to us. All these other things that are a bunch of nonsense. You encounter that as well. But back to the main point: exoteric for esoteric systems even of the same system diverge greatly on almost every single angle of interpretation, from interpretation of scripture to interpretation of the nature of the human being to the nature of the cosmos and how it has been emanated and manifested into being by, so to speak, the deity, which in the esoteric traditions they never give a name to, and it is never male. Well, in all the Abrahamic traditions, exoteric traditions, it's always a male creator god without a female, which is inherently an unbalanced conceptual framework for any system of belief in a universe that's clearly based on the binary principle and flows from that. So, and there it is. It is honestly interesting to note that some of these traditions, I don't know about Islam, but Christianity and Judaism actually did have originally, way back in the early days, a divine feminine counterpart to the male patriarchal deities, and they were removed later on. And mainly they were removed in the Jewish tradition, which is the foundation and basis for the Christian tradition. So it was removed, but they had a Sephira and a divine feminine counterpart to Yahweh or Jehovah, and that was eventually removed for an all-male patriarchal deity at some point, which was, so to speak, on now unbalanced system when they only focused on the male side, because all things require balance and equilibrium in the universe, and thus the binary of male and female, positive and negative system of and conceptualization of the universe is a necessity for all manifested things to even coexist in equilibrium. Thus, any system without both is unbalanced and, you know, distorted concept of the entire cosmic structure, as well as your relation to it. So, and that's been a serious problem throughout, obviously, the last 2,000 years. really, after, well, it was certainly 1500, since the fall of Rome and the death of Hypatia in 415 AD, when she was murdered in the street by a crowd of rabid fanatics that were Christians, literally tore limb from limb, and she was an Alexandrian scholar. That's the start of the Dark Ages, according to many historians, actually, because that started to be the death of that long guarded tradition of knowledge on all sorts of things that she represented as a Gnostic scholar in Alexandria. And she was in a feud with the bishop of Alexandria, and he kind of sent one of his cronies, Peter the Mad, down there, who got the rabble together and put them into a frenzy, and they tore her apart, literally, and destroyed her bones and threw them into the sea. And thus begins the Dark Ages and the destruction of many temples and many places that held sacred texts that we'll never know about, with volumes and volumes of knowledge from the ancients and the ancient traditions that have been aggregated and collected for hundreds and hundreds of years and were obliterated. And so the esoteric tradition was destroyed by the exoteric tradition, certainly around 415 AD and onwards. And that was obviously a mistake, terrible mistake, because what we ended up having after that, after the 200 years of, a different form of Christianity, we had a forced form after the Council of Nicaea and the other councils, which basically cemented and solidified the concepts behind exoteric Christianity and Catholicism, and into a framework that was largely unbending and very materialistically based. I would add, because they did not really allow any philosophical inquiry, much at all, because the basis they had to work with was very limited. By cementing those ideas into place, they were forced into a structure of belief that was so limiting, the esoteric didn't even have a place anymore. So, not to mention they rooted it out and destroyed it, and they truly did. Though went underground and ended up in the east, and you know the empires of Muhammad. Not that he chose these esoteric tenets at all for his religion, but there was allowed to exist over there to a degree. They kept it secret, but there's many instances of this where sheiks and various religious orders that were esoteric somehow thrived in secret and kept the works of Plato and the Hermetists and the Egyptians and the pagan mystery schools alive until they were reintroduced into Europe in the Enlightenment era. But even then, a lot of it has been either thrown out, labeled superstitious nonsense, labeled fantastical, and on now of course unscientific since the 1800s, and no real inquiry was ever allowed, and the church of course didn't want it to be allowed either. So both attacked it, and here we are today, where largely no one has any idea what exoteric and esoteric traditions are. They only know the one, exoteric. They don't even know it's called exoteric at all. And in the exoteric, you get the very basic beliefs for the masses promulgated popularly in all the major world religions, whether it's Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, doesn't really matter. They all have an inner esoteric tradition that is reserved for the priest class, not even meaning the normal priest class like your average pastor, but the more secretive priest class, and is preserved, and they don't really ever come out with it very much. They did under Blavatsky, but for the most part, and without her, we wouldn't even know as much as we do at all. So the exoteric traditions had basically completely overturned it. And anytime it popped up again, like with the Albigensians in I think it was the 1200s of the Middle Ages, they were destroyed by a crusade. It was called the Albigensian Crusade. The Cathars were wiped out by order of the Pope because they were essentially practicing a Gnostic belief system, which, interestingly enough, was, so to speak, feminist in the sense that it allowed both men and women into the priesthood, and said that a sound religion was based on both genders being involved in it, and the interchange of the positive and negative energies that go along with that exchange in a system of spirituality. And they were wiped out. And, any other time that it popped up, this happened, every time. Though that's a big one. So esoteric has been largely hidden from the public mind. And this inner tradition is just absolutely staggering in its potential to uplift humanity into a much more spiritualized framework of existence in this world that we live in this universe, and in our relationship to God and relationship to each other as a human brotherhood. While a lot of the exoteric religious systems have very much obviously fought each other to the death, engaged in many, many wars throughout the last 2,000 years, trying to destroy each other, as well as spread their belief system far and wide as much as they can with the sword if necessary. And they did. While the esoteric tradition was hidden, was never engaging in any sort of violence, and was always in the background, not thriving, but in the background. It used to thrive in the pre-Christian era. And so esotericism gives a very philosophical and metaphysical framework that is unique and expanded in content than the exoteric traditions do. The exoteric traditions really try to keep it very simplified and very watered down version of what was the real tradition, so to speak, the esoteric tradition. So in esoteric Christianity, which is Rosicrucianism and anthroposophy, founded by Rudolf Steiner, there is a completely different explanation for a lot of the things found in the Bible that exoteric, the exoteric system and their adherents take very, very literally. So they, in all these esoteric texts, like the ones I have behind me, and especially when these very academic esoteric scholars were translating and interpreting these texts, as well as the Bible, they would always explain it as there's the doctrine of the dead letter, the literalism, the deep literalism that is generally pervade to the people, and then there's what they call the spirit of the scripture, the spirit of the law, as opposed to the body of the law. Each its opposite. So the body and the literal text is all that's ever propagated to the average person. The spirit of the scripture and of universal cosmic law is never explained. And largely, they may not even really know it themselves. Your average pastor or priest, they don't. I mean, it was hard. I can't. It was 30 years before I even found this stuff. Not that I was looking, but I mean, I'd never even heard of it. And so, if you wanted to really highlight the differences between an esoteric and exoteric system, the main distinctions are one of the main distinctions is a much expanded version and framework for how the universe came into being, the nature of the deity, the absolute, they would call it, and the extreme distinction between the spiritual planes and the material plane, but in detail that they never give you in any of these exoteric creeds ever. So, I mean, for example, in Genesis, they explain the creation of the universe seemingly in a few passages in a couple of chapters, and it's all over. I mean, it's not even barely a summary. It's not even the cliff notes, really. While in esoteric Christianity, like in Max Hondel's Rosicrucian Cosmic Conception or Blavatsky's Secret Doctrine or Rudolf Steiner's Cosmic Memory and many others, the the level of detail of the cosmology system that they present is astounding. I mean, it's unbelievable. I mean, it goes on for hundreds of pages as opposed to 2 or 3 pages, and it's a form of it's like a spiritual science to explain the metaphysics of cosmic manifestation from the absolute down into our literal material 3D plane of existence on Earth. And there's so many stages in between, and so many gradations of the different levels of densification, different levels of materialization and and the different spiritual distinctions made in this journey down from cosmic creator to material man, that there's a whole evolutionary scheme, a whole spiritual evolutionary scheme that is in all of them, and it's the same scheme, which is what astounded me, is because I read all the different systems, not every system, but the main Western ones, and they all agree on this spiritual evolutionary scheme. While in the exoteric tradition of the Abrahamic religions, you don't get any of that. You get none of that. You get like a few pages of a briefly summarized, nonsensical creation narrative that makes literally no sense, gives no individual an idea of what any of that means, and how any of it really occurred, and they skip over and go straight into these other things, and they do the same thing, and all of them really. While saying, now let's go to the Jewish tradition. Well, what is the Jewish esoteric tradition? Well, that's the Kabbalah. In the Kabbalah, you have a completely different cosmic story and conceptualization of man, his relation to the universe and to the absolute, which is called Ein Sof. You have none of that in the Talmud or the Torah or the Old Testament. None of it's there. They don't talk about it because it was only for the elect. It was only for the initiated. And there's references to it in the Old Testament in various ways. And the Kabbalists would say you can interpret entire chapters and entire books in the Bible only through Kabbalistic means. Whether it's turning the words back in Hebrew and then looking for their numerical values based on converting them into the different number sets of gematria, or whether it's reading it through a metaphysical lens or reading it through a spiritual lens or an astronomical or astrological lens, as opposed to the only lens that is typically used is the literalist lens that is pretty much the only one on offer for most people. And then it's not even really their fault. They don't know. They have no clue that there might be a much deeper, more philosophical, more metaphysical system behind their beloved system of belief that would not destroy it, would enrich it, greatly enrich it, and expand it into a greater holistic unity of belief and thought than they might have ever believed was possible. But whenever you mention this to them, either they're offended, they're dismissive, or they just really have no framework for what you're even talking about. It doesn't even really compute when you try to explain it to them. It's like you're trying to tell them you found the truth and they didn't, or yours is just just another exoteric system, when it's none of the above. I'm always looking for more. There's no end to the truth. The journey never ends. It'll go on the rest of my life. Having studied all these things, I'm still studying, and I will be forever. And the point is to try to explain to you, the audience, and people, that the level of depth is drastically different in esoteric versus exoteric systems, and the level of depth matters. It truly does. Now, I don't expect everyone to want to go read the 1,600-page book by Blavatsky, The Secret Doctrine, back there next to Thoth on the shelf right behind my head, or any of her written articles that are in those books next to him, or study the Kabbalistic book over there on the behind me also, or the Kabbalion. But maybe you could, maybe you would, but it doesn't. It's never meant to be done quickly. I mean, it's a long study, obviously. But point being that there's a lot that your average Christian, Islamic adherent, or and Jewish, synagogue, congregation doesn't understand. And this level of misunderstanding has led to a lot of really bad things that the esoteric tradition could really help alleviate in our current world of absolute conflict in the Middle East between Islam and Judaism, or with the Christians coming in from America, which is my country, allegedly Christian anyway, and aiding one against the other or pitting them against each other. And we could avoid all this. We could take humanity to the next level if this if these traditions weren't much more widely distributed, much more widely presented to the average person, and extrapolated and delineated to them, as opposed to what we typically have gotten. It was a lot of pseudo, not even really pseudo philosophy, just pseudo religion that is based in abs, cul-de-sacs separated from each other, when there's an absolute unity among all of them if you look behind the veil. And the veil isn't so dense that the average person can't do it. The average person can totally do that. They have to be willing to do it. They have to want to do it. Because esotericism, in a large way, is to a degree, esoteric spirituality, theosophy, Rosicrucianism, anthroposophy. The ideas that were presented in the late 1800s and early 1900s by individuals like Blavatsky, Max Heindel, Rudolf Steiner, and many others were designed and had the intention of uniting humanity in a brotherhood of mankind. Not like a socialist one, but a spiritual one. And not by force. Never by force. Ever. It cannot be forced. It has to be taught. It has to be a form of human enlightenment for the whole species, where we don't see each other as separate and distinct races or separate and distinct, religious adherents that are at war with each other. Instead, we see each other as united in a common brotherhood of spirituality for the whole human race, and could greatly benefit from such a unity in our world of absolute division and atomization. And especially today with the digital age, it's just unparalleled. We're more divided than ever. We're more atomized than ever, and it's obviously by design, but it doesn't have to be that way. Nothing is written. Nothing is, fated. With the rise of artificial intelligence and transhumanism and, smart cities, smart world, with, likes of Elon Musk running around, and Sam Altman and all these other guys, they have a whole other vision for the world than the one the esoteric tradition wants, and also the one the exoteric religions want as well. And, it's gonna be a big deal if they succeed. It's gonna be very bad. And they're gonna wipe out your exoteric religion or convert it into some sort of artificial intelligence god of a religion that will be a one world religion, but not one that's a universal brotherhood of mankind, of a universal brotherhood of the enslaved to the machine. And, the descent towards this is always approaching, closer and closer every day. And humanity needs to wake up and really start to fundamentally understand the esoteric tradition, and why, to me, and why to many others, it seems absolutely essential to understand the knowledge that is offered and presented in the esoteric traditions about ourselves, about the universe, about God and our relationship to it, and our relationship to our environment. I mean, it doesn't have to be liberal versus conservative, environment, pro environmentalism, anti environmentalism, pro climate change. All those are just the dialectic of Hegel being used to divide and conquer us, while there is a much more common field of spiritual understanding behind ideas about protecting our environment and our sacred duty to the earth as a spiritual being herself, Sophia or Gaia, and has nothing to do with any of the political ramifications. And the esoteric tradition offers a totally different view about our relationship to the earth, and our relationship to animals, to plants, to planets out there in the beyond, and to each other, mainly to each other and to the environment, and the relationship to the deity, which there is not a personal one in the esoteric tradition. It's incapable of being personal, but it's a much deeper philosophical and rich understanding of our connection to the divine, as opposed to our relationship with a divine. There's a big difference. And it expands consciousness instead of restricting it, as a lot of the exoteric ones do. It's my God versus your God. It's my religion versus your religion. Even within the traditions themselves, Sunni versus Shia, Baptist versus Protestant. I mean, Protestant versus Catholic, and then within the Protestant churches. So I mean, you know, there's a war going on for your mind and for your spiritual mind and your spiritual bodies. And to win that war, we need to unite in understanding the esoteric occult traditions and the mystery school knowledge that has been propagated and kept secret and under guard by the hierophants of the ancient world today, in keeping with their charge of guiding humanity into the future. And at the moment, humanity is absolutely not only failing ourselves, but we're failing them as well. And we have a responsibility to awaken and to guide ourselves collectively into a better future instead of a dystopian one. And we can do that. We really can do that if people are willing to wake up and take a step outside their comforting systems of belief about many things, and embrace a wider and a more expanded view of the nature of the universe and yourself, which largely comes from esotericism, spiritual esotericism. So that's what I want to say on exoteric versus esoteric traditions. And, you know, the esoteric tradition, any of them, offer a far greater chance of success in our crazy world today than any of the exoteric ones that have totally become solidified and crystallized in their systems of belief and really aren't offering much to anybody anymore. To some they might, but are they really? Are they uniting everybody behind any sort of common theme that isn't actually just a manipulation by the power elite against us? Are they creating a greater brotherhood of humanity in a spiritual sense, not in a political or societal sense, materialistic sense? Are we actually progressing spiritually, or are we devolving spiritually, morally, in every way? And we are obviously devolving, and we don't have to. There's a much better evolutionary track, spiritual evolutionary track that we can follow if people will dive in and look into the esoteric tradition and see what it has to offer. And they might just find something they really might like.